Charlotte's small fingers clutched the hem of her dress as the adults around her argued. Her parents were gone, leaving her alone in the world. The village elders and her uncles raised their voices, each offering opinions about what to do with her. "She has no one here to take care of her," one uncle said, his tone firm. "Send her to Mrs. Grace in the city. She'll have a better life there." Another uncle grumbled, but eventually nodded in agreement. With the decision made, Charlotte was sent off to live with her aunt, Mrs. Grace, who was married but childless. When Charlotte arrived, Mrs. Grace welcomed her with a stiff hug, muttering, "We'll take care of you now." Mr. James stood nearby, watching silently, his eyes lingering on Charlotte. The house was big, filled with polished furniture and expensive curtains, but it felt cold and unfamiliar. Charlotte sat quietly by the window, her small figure hunched, staring out at the city she had once hoped would be a place of safety. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the room, but her eyes remained dull, fixed on nothing in particular. The sound of footsteps approached her door, and it creaked open. Mr. James appeared in the doorway, his presence looming over her like a shadow. He leaned in slightly, speaking softly, but his words felt heavy and ominous. Charlotte's fingers tightened around the hem of her dress, her body rigid with confusion and fear. She said nothing, her gaze locked on the floor. Mr. James stepped closer, his voice low, as he instructed her to follow him. Her heart began to race, a knot forming deep in her chest, but she moved, not out of choice, but because she knew there was no other option. Inside her room, she clung to the edge of her bed, her small hands gripping the blanket as he came closer. The room felt too small, too suffocating. The tears began to fall, silently at first, then more urgently, as Charlotte begged, her voice trembling. She tried to push him away, but his hold was too strong. Her body ached with every movement, her sobs filling the silent space, but the pain and the terror in her eyes went unnoticed. Outside, the door to Mrs. Grace's shop closed with a soft click. Mrs. Grace moved briskly through the crowded aisles, her focus entirely on the customers, her mind far away from the home she had left behind. She was surrounded by fabric, orders, and numbers, but her thoughts never strayed beyond the business. The phone rang at the counter, and she answered it without a second thought, her voice smooth and practiced, as if her world didn't feel empty and hollow without her attention at home. Back in Charlotte's room, time seemed to drag on, the room becoming unbearably still, except for the sound of Charlotte's muffled cries. When it was over, she lay motionless on the bed, her eyes staring blankly at the ceiling. Her body trembled, but there was no one there to comfort her, no one to hear her pain. The minutes passed in silence, the only noise the soft rustle of clothes as Mr. James left the room, his footsteps fading down the hall. As the door clicked shut behind him, Charlotte remained where she was, the tears no longer flowing, as though her body had given up trying. There was no one left to listen, no one who cared to hear her. One evening Mrs. Grace sat at the dining table, a stack of papers scattered in front of her. The rustling of pages filled the room as her pen moved across the ledger, marking down numbers with precision. The soft clinking of coins and the quiet shuffle of bills blended into the background, a familiar rhythm that absorbed her full attention. Charlotte stood nearby, her small frame tense. She glanced down at her feet, her fingers nervously tugging at the hem of her shirt. Her breath came in short, shaky bursts. She opened her mouth, but the words seemed to catch in her throat. With a hesitant step forward, she whispered, "Mommy, why does Daddy always hurt me when you are not around?" Mrs. Grace didn't lift her head. Her eyes stayed glued to the figures on the page, unfazed by the tremble in her daughter's voice. She turned the page without hesitation, her pen gliding over the numbers, not missing a beat. "Charlotte, please, not now," she muttered, her voice distant as she flipped through the papers. Charlotte's grip on her shirt tightened. She shuffled her feet, feeling the weight of her words hang in the air. "But Mommy," her voice cracked, but Mrs. Grace didn't look up. The room seemed to close in around Charlotte, her own voice too small to reach her mother. "I said I'm busy," Mrs. Grace snapped, her voice sharp, her eyes finally lifting, but not with concern. They flashed with irritation, and her gaze quickly returned to her work. "Go to your room." Charlotte stood frozen for a moment, her face pale and expressionless. She opened her mouth again, but no sound came out. Her chest tightened as she swallowed hard. Her fingers slowly released the hem of her shirt, and she turned, her footsteps soft and heavy as she walked away. In the silence of her room, Charlotte stood by her window, staring out at the world beyond, her hands pressed against the cool glass. Her small body trembled as she wrapped her arms around herself. She could hear the faint sounds of her father's movements in the hallway, but she didn't turn. She knew what would happen next. Night after night, when the house grew quiet and Mrs. Grace was at the shop, Mr. James would slip into Charlotte's room. She could feel his eyes on her, and the coldness of his presence filled the space around her. His hands were always rough, and his words lingered. "I'm trying to make you feel like a woman." Charlotte would flinch, her tears falling silently as she curled into herself, her body trembling with fear and pain. She would speak, but her voice barely made it past her lips. "But Daddy, it's always painful. I don't like it. I'm going to tell Mommy." His voice was low, almost a growl, as he grabbed her chin, forcing her to meet his eyes. "If you tell anyone, you will die. Do you want to die?" Charlotte's eyes widened in terror, and she shook her head furiously, her heart racing. "No," she whispered, her body shaking uncontrollably. She kept quiet, pressing herself into the corner of her bed, her mind screaming for someone to hear her, to see her pain. But all she could do was wait for the night to end, for the hours to pass, each minute dragging by in a haze of fear. And all the while, she carried the heavy weight of a secret no one would ever hear. Charlotte sat on the staircase, her body curled into itself, shoulders shaking as tears streamed down her face. Her swollen eyes ached, but she could barely feel it over the heaviness in her chest. The sound of her sobs echoed through the dimly lit house, a hollow reminder of her constant longing for someone to hear her, to understand her. She wiped at her cheeks with the back of her hand, a futile attempt to dry her tears, and took a shuddering breath. She stood up slowly, her legs unsteady, and walked toward the kitchen where her mother was. Mrs. Grace was at the table, her fingers nimbly counting the bills. The rustle of paper was the only sound that filled the air as Charlotte stood in the doorway, hesitant. Her heart pounded in her chest, and she swallowed hard, trying to find the words she had rehearsed over and over. She opened her mouth, but the words caught in her throat. "Mom, can I talk to you?" Charlotte whispered, her voice trembling. She stepped forward, her fingers brushing against the cold edge of the table, her hand shaking. Mrs. Grace didn't even look up from the pile of cash in front of her, her face focused and detached. "What is it now, Charlotte?" Mrs. Grace replied, her tone flat, as if Charlotte's presence barely registered. "You're always complaining about something." Charlotte's eyes flickered toward the table, her breath quickening. She glanced at her mother's face for a moment, but all she saw was a blank expression, eyes narrowed in concentration. Charlotte's throat tightened, and she felt the words suffocating her. "It's about what Daddy does when you're not home." He. Her voice broke, and she couldn't continue. The words felt too heavy, too dangerous to speak. Mrs. Grace didn't respond right away. Her fingers continued to count the money, her eyes never leaving the bills. Then, without looking up, she slammed the cash onto the table, the sharp noise cutting through the air. "Charlotte, I don't have time for this," she snapped, the irritation in her voice rising. She stood up abruptly, the chair scraping across the floor. "You're always making up stories. Your father works hard to take care of us, and you're just trying to cause trouble. You little brat." Charlotte's face burned, her hands trembling as she clasped them tightly in front of her. The tears that had threatened to fall before now flowed freely, soaking her cheeks. Her voice cracked as she begged, "But Mom, please." Mrs. Grace took a step back, her hands resting on her hips, her posture rigid and unyielding. "I said enough," she shouted, her patience finally snapping. "If you're not happy here, maybe you should go back to the village to your late parents' house. Maybe that will be better for you. You're being dramatic, trying to get attention." Charlotte's mouth went dry. The words she had so desperately tried to speak lay abandoned between them. She felt small, invisible, as though her mother's words were walls closing in around her. She opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Mrs. Grace didn't even look at her anymore, turning her back as she walked out of the room. Charlotte stood in the silence that followed, her shoulders slumped in defeat. She wiped her tears away, but it didn't help. No matter how much she cried, how hard she tried, her mother never listened. The one person she had counted on, the one person who was supposed to protect her, had just shut her out. Charlotte's heart ached, and the loneliness settled in, heavier than before. The next morning, Charlotte sat at the breakfast table, barely moving, her eyes dull and distant. She pushed the cereal around with her spoon, not even noticing when Mrs. Grace entered the room. Mrs. Grace was already dressed, her movements swift and practiced. She grabbed her bag, stuffing it with papers and money without a second thought. "Make sure you behave today, Charlotte," Mrs. Grace said, kissing the top of Charlotte's head, her lips barely grazing her skin. She didn't notice the tears that still stained Charlotte's face, nor the empty look in her eyes. "I have to meet an important client as soon as possible." Without another word, Mrs. Grace was gone, the door clicking shut behind her, leaving Charlotte in the same quiet despair. Mr. James entered the room soon after, his eyes scanning Charlotte with an unsettling gaze. The smile he gave her felt wrong, too wide, too knowing. His presence was a cold weight in the room, and Charlotte could feel her stomach churn. She forced herself to look away, her chest tightening with dread. She tried to push the unease away, but it stuck to her like a shadow, always there, always watching. Days turned into weeks, and Charlotte found herself caught in the same routine. Each time she tried to speak, to tell her mother what was happening, Mrs. Grace dismissed her. She was too busy with work, too distracted with her business to hear her daughter's cries. Every time Charlotte's voice shook with fear, Mrs. Grace responded with cold indifference. "Stop making up stories," she would say. "You're lucky to have a roof over your head. Don't you see how hard I'm working?" Charlotte stopped trying to speak up. Her words fell silent, unheard, as she withdrew into herself. She stopped laughing, stopped asking for help. The world outside grew distant, and the silence inside her grew louder. She no longer felt like a part of it. Then, one day, everything changed. Mrs. Grace came home early, her footsteps light as she entered the house. It was unusual. She never came back this early. She heard voices coming from Charlotte's room, and her heart skipped a beat. She hesitated, unsure of what to do, but curiosity pushed her forward. She followed the sound, each step more uncertain than the last. She reached Charlotte's door and stopped, her breath caught in her throat. The scene inside was something she couldn't process at first. Her eyes went wide, unable to comprehend what she was seeing. There, in front of her, was Mr. James, her husband, in an intimate moment with Charlotte. The horror of the truth crashed over her in waves, and before she could react, her hands shot out, shoving him away from her daughter. "No!" she screamed, her voice cracking with disbelief. She wrapped her arms around Charlotte, pulling her close, shielding her from the monster in their midst. Charlotte's small, trembling body clung to her, her sobs muffled in Mrs. Grace's arms. Mrs. Grace's world spun out of control. She called the authorities with shaking hands, barely able to process what had just happened. Mr. James was taken away, his excuses falling on deaf ears. He claimed that Mrs. Grace had been too busy, that he needed companionship, but nothing could justify his actions. Charlotte was taken for counseling, slowly beginning to heal, though the scars would always remain. Mrs. Grace, racked with guilt, realized the full extent of her failures. She quit her job, devoting herself to repairing her relationship with her daughter, understanding now that love, care, and presence were worth more than anything money could buy. As for Mr. James, he was locked away in prison, his life forever defined by the horror he had caused. Mrs. Grace learned the hardest lesson of all. Always listen to the ones you love, especially when they come to you with pain. Ignoring their cries can cause more suffering than you can imagine. No amount of success can replace the love and trust of a child. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this story. I hope you learned the importance of being a good and understanding parent, someone who listens, not like Mrs. Grace or Mr. James. If you enjoyed this story, please click the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you'll be the first to know when I post new stories. If you're a returning subscriber, I want to say a big thank you for your continued support. It means a lot to me.